They all laughed that he only inherited his grandmother's old chair, but one accidental discovery inside turned his life upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching this story from. The cemetery road was narrow and half buried under wet autumn leaves, the kind that stuck to shoes and clung to the hem of his trousers no matter how carefully he walked. The air smelled of cold soil and extinguished candles, a bitter mixture that seemed to soak directly into his lungs and stay there. He had not cried at the graveside, not because he did not feel anything, but because everything inside him had gone quiet, as if the world had turned the volume down at the exact moment the coffin disappeared into the ground. Around him, people moved, whispered, checked their phones, exchanged tired condolences that sounded rehearsed, and then drifted back toward their cars with the awkward speed of those who no longer had a reason to linger. He remained standing long after the others had gone, staring at the patch of dark earth that marked the end of his grandmother's life. She had raised him more than his own parents ever had. When he was a child, she had been the only one who never asked him what he wanted to become, never mocked his failures, never demanded he prove anything. She simply listened. And now, when there were no more words to exchange, he realized with a dull ache that he had never truly asked her about herself. He had known her habits, her routine, the way she always took the same chair by the window in the evenings, the way she sat with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. But he had never known what lay behind that gaze. The house felt different without her, even before anyone had touched a single object. The air inside was heavier, trapped, as though it were still waiting for her to walk in and take her place in the corner of the living room. Relatives filled the rooms in restless waves, opening cupboards, peeking into drawers, speaking in lowered voices that carried the thinly veiled excitement of people who expected to leave with something of value. He drifted from one room to another without purpose, a guest in the home where he had once felt most at ease. Every step stirred memories he had not invited. The small dent in the hallway wall from the day he had crashed his bicycle indoors. The chipped tile in the kitchen she had promised to fix, but never did. The faint mark on the wallpaper near the window where the back of her chair had rubbed for years. That chair was still there. It stood a little crooked, one leg shorter than the others, the faded upholstery sagging in the middle like tired skin. It was not beautiful. It never had been. Even as a child, he had wondered why she never replaced it, why she kept sitting on something that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. He had assumed it was simply thrift, the stubbornness of someone who had lived through shortages and never fully trusted abundance. But now, as he paused in front of it, he felt something tighten in his chest. The room was noisy with conversation, yet around the chair there seemed to be a pocket of silence, as if it still belonged to her in a way nothing else did. The distribution of possessions began with the items everyone considered important. Jewelry was sorted and weighed, documents were stacked and assigned, the television and appliances were claimed by those who spoke the loudest and fastest. He remained in the background, unnoticed and, in truth, relieved to be so. He had no home of his own to fill, no place where any of these things would fit naturally. His life was a series of rented rooms and temporary arrangements, the kind that left no space for heirlooms. When it came time for him to choose, there was an uncomfortable pause. Someone gestured vaguely toward the corner of the room where the chair stood as it always had, patient and unimpressive. A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the group, the kind that did not aim to wound but did so anyway. A cousin suggested he take the chair as if it were a joke. Another relative shrugged and said that at least it would save them the trouble of throwing it out. He felt their eyes on him, waiting for embarrassment, for refusal, for him to admit that he deserved nothing better. Instead, he nodded. The word did not leave his mouth, but the decision was clear enough in the way he stepped forward and gripped the backrest. The wood felt rough under his fingers, the varnish long gone, the surface worn smooth in the places where her hands had rested. The chair protested, with a faint creak as he lifted it, and for a moment he thought it might finally give up. But it held, as it always had, stubborn to the end. The laughter followed him out the door. It stayed with him as he struggled to fit the chair into the back of his car, as he tied it down with the fraying rope he found in the trunk, as he drove away from the house that had been the closest thing to stability he had ever known. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller until it was nothing more than a pale square against the gray afternoon, and then it disappeared entirely. His apartment was barely more than a box. A single room with a kitchenette pressed against one wall and a window that looked out onto the side of another building. There was no place where the chair truly belonged, yet he carried it inside and set it near the window without thinking, as if his body remembered the arrangement even if his mind did not. The room felt different immediately, as though it had acquired a center of gravity it had lacked before. For days he left the chair untouched. It stood there like an accusation, its sagging seat and peeling finish reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he had never possessed. At night, he would catch himself glancing at it before turning off the light, half expecting to see his grandmother sitting there, hands folded, waiting for him to notice something he had missed. Eventually, practicality forced his hand. The chair was not safe to sit on. The frame wobbled, the fabric was threadbare, and every time he brushed past it, a fine dust of age seemed to fall to the floor. He decided to move it to the garage below the building, where he could think about repairs without worrying about breaking it further. Carrying it down the narrow stairwell was a clumsy, exhausting process. The chair scraped the walls, shedding flakes of old varnish, and by the time he reached the concrete floor of the garage, his arms were trembling. He set it down more heavily than he meant to, and the sound it made was wrong. It was not the hollow knock of wood on cement, but something duller, as if he had dropped a box with something soft but solid inside. He frowned, knelt, and tapped the seat with his knuckles. The response was uneven. In some places it rang hollow, in others it gave back the same muted thud he had heard a moment earlier. For a long time he simply knelt there, listening to the echo fade into the dim space. He told himself it was nothing, that old furniture often behaved strangely, that he was letting grief sharpen his imagination. But when he stood and struck the seat again, carefully this time, the sound was unmistakable. There was something inside the chair that did not belong there. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like an invitation. He brought the chair closer to the single hanging bulb and examined the underside. The fabric was stretched tight across the frame, held in place by a line of rusted staples and crooked nails. In several spots, the stitching looked different, thicker, as though it had been reinforced by hand. He had no memory of the chair ever being repaired, yet here was evidence that someone had opened it before and taken care to close it again. He hesitated with the screwdriver in his hand. This chair had been hers. Every thread of it carried the shape of her presence. Opening it felt like trespassing, like prying open a door that had been deliberately kept shut. But the alternative was to leave it as it was, to ignore the weight inside and pretend he had never noticed. He knew he would not be able to do that. Whatever lay hidden in the seat had already changed the chair in his mind from a relic into a question, and questions demanded answers. He worked slowly, easing out the staples one by one, careful not to tear the fragile fabric. Dust and fragments of dried foam fell to the floor in a soft, persistent rain. The smell that rose from inside the seat was stale and unmistakably old, a mixture of cloth and paper that had not seen light in decades. When the last corner of the upholstery came free, he lifted it aside and leaned closer, shining his phone's flashlight into the narrow cavity beneath the cushion. The beam caught on folded edges on the corner of something that was not part of the chair's construction. He reached in, fingers brushing against cool paper, and drew out the first object that had been waiting there all this time. The paper he pulled from the cavity trembled in his hands before he even knew what it was. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a folded sheet that had lost the battle with time, its edges yellowed, its surface freckled with brown specks. But when he unfolded it, the beam of his phone's flashlight revealed dense blocks of print, arranged in columns, with a headline that seemed to reach at him across the decades. A newspaper clipping. Then another followed, and another, until he had a small stack resting on the cold concrete floor of the garage beside his knees. The hollow sound he had heard when the chair struck the ground no longer felt mysterious. It felt deliberate. Someone had measured that cavity, had chosen exactly what to hide and how to hide it. He read without really understanding at first, letting his eyes slide over names, places, dates that meant nothing to him yet. One article described a residential fire that had displaced several families. Another mentioned a controversial development project that stalled after allegations of forged deeds. In the margins of more than one clipping, he noticed faint pencil marks, circles around surnames, underlined street names, a question mark scrawled next to a paragraph that hinted at corruption but never quite named it. He leaned back against the side of the chair, the wood rough against his shoulder blades, and forced himself to slow down. This was not a single discovery. It was a collection, a pattern. He laid the clippings out in front of him, arranging them by date as best he could. The earliest were from more than 30 years ago, printed in a font that belonged to a different era. The latest were still old, but close enough to the present to feel unsettling, as if the story they told had only recently gone silent. When he reached back into the cavity again, his fingers brushed something smooth and stiff. Photographs slid into his palm, their edges curled inward from years of confinement. He spread them beside the clippings, careful not to bend them further. They showed people standing in front of houses, gathered around tables, leaning against fences. None of the faces were familiar, yet the scenes themselves felt strangely intimate, as if he were intruding on moments that had never been meant for him. On the back of one photo, written in the same steady hand he remembered from birthday cards and shopping lists, was a date and two initials he did not recognize. Only then did he notice the heavier weight beneath the papers, the object that had given the hollow sound its density. It was wrapped in a faded envelope, the seal long since cracked. Inside was a document stamped with official insignia, the ink dulled but legible. A land deed. His grandmother's name was printed in neat, formal letters, followed by a parcel number and a description of a property he had never heard her mention. The address was not far from the town where she had lived, yet it might as well have been on another continent for all the meaning it held for him. He sat there for a long time, the garage light buzzing overhead, the cold seeping through his jeans, trying to reconcile the woman he had known with the evidence now spread before him. She had never spoken of owning land. She had never hinted at a fire, at legal battles, at people whose faces were now staring up at him from the floor. The grandmother, he remembered, was quiet to the point of invisibility, a figure who moved through life without leaving ripples. And yet, here was proof that she had once been entangled in events that made headlines. He gathered the items back into a loose pile and slid them carefully onto the seat of the chair, as though the wood might offer them protection. The cavity still held more. His hand explored the narrow space and encountered a resistance that was not paper. The fabric lining was thicker in one section, reinforced with a seam that did not match the rest of the upholstery. His breath caught. The discovery of the first layer had been enough to upend everything he thought he knew. Whatever lay behind this second barrier had the power to change even more. He returned to the apartment that night without the chair, leaving it disassembled in the garage like a body on an operating table. Sleep did not come easily. Images of burning houses, of anonymous faces and old photographs, of his grandmother's name printed in bureaucratic type, swam behind his closed eyes. By morning, he was already dressed, descending the stairs with a purpose he had not felt in years. The second layer yielded with a soft, tearing sound that echoed in the empty garage. He worked with the same care as before, peeling back the reinforced fabric to reveal a tightly bound bundle. This time, there was no doubt about what he was holding. The weight was unmistakable, the shape too regular to be anything but money. He cut the string and unfolded the cloth, exposing stacks of banknotes in denominations that spanned decades. Some bore designs he recognized from his childhood. Others were so old they looked like artifacts from a museum. His first reaction was disbelief. A woman who had counted coins at the kitchen table, who had mended clothes rather than buy new ones, who had insisted that he take leftovers home so they would not go to waste, had hidden a fortune inside the chair where she spent her evenings. It was not a fortune in the sense of wealth that could change the world, but it was far more than he had ever seen her possess at any one time. Enough to have made a difference had she chosen to use it. Beneath the money lay a single sheet of paper, folded so many times it seemed permanently creased into a grid. When he opened it, the pattern of her life came into focus in a way the clippings never had. Names ran down the page in a narrow column, each followed by an address or a brief note. Some entries were crossed out with a firm line, others left untouched. Next to a few names were short words written in smaller script, almost like afterthoughts. Children, winter, surgery, debt. The meaning of the list did not strike him all at once. It grew gradually, like an image developing in a dark room. He thought of the times his grandmother had left the house with a small envelope in her purse, claiming she had errands to run. He thought of the unexplained absences, the days when she had returned looking more tired than usual, her hands trembling just slightly as she set the kettle on the stove. He had assumed age was finally catching up with her. Now he wondered how many lives had intersected with hers in ways he had never imagined. One entry stopped him completely. His own surname appeared halfway down the page, followed by his childhood address and a note that made his throat tighten. "If you find this, you will understand." He closed his eyes, the garage spinning gently around him, and for the first time since her funeral, he felt tears press against his lids. Whatever she had been preparing for, she had known he would be the one to discover it. The chair, the hidden compartments, the careful arrangement of evidence and money had all been a message addressed to him, written in wood and paper instead of words. He packed everything back into the cavity, not out of fear, but out of instinct, returning the chair to the state in which he had found it. This was not a treasure to be displayed. It was a responsibility to be deciphered. That evening, after carrying the chair back upstairs, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the list until the light faded from the window. He did not yet know what he was going to do with the information, only that he could no longer pretend it was not there. The next morning, he chose one name at random, an address not far from his apartment. He told himself it was just to satisfy his curiosity, that he would not interfere with lives that were not his own. But when he stood in front of the building an hour later, staring up at peeling paint and sagging balconies, he felt the first thread of a connection stretching taut between his grandmother's past and his own uncertain present. He stood in front of the building longer than he meant to, reading and rereading the address on the crumpled photograph he had brought with him, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something more familiar. The structure was older than the rest of the block, its brick darkened by soot and rain, the windows patched with mismatched curtains that spoke of many tenants passing through and none staying long enough to leave a mark. It did not look like a place where anyone would want to revisit their past, and yet this was where his grandmother had directed him across the years with nothing but ink on a folded page. He did not knock. He did not know why, only that the idea of standing at a stranger's door and explaining the origin of his visit felt like a violation. Instead, he walked the length of the sidewalk and back, committing the building to memory, the crooked mailbox at the entrance, the faint smell of fried onions drifting from an open window on the second floor. It was enough, for now, to know that the address was real, that it had not been a fiction scribbled by a confused old woman. When he finally turned away, the sense of being watched followed him down the street, not by eyes and windows, but by the quiet weight of expectation that had lodged itself somewhere behind his ribs. He returned to his apartment and set the chair by the window, unable to banish the feeling that it was observing him in return. He did not sit on it. He circled it, fingers brushing the backrest, tracing the path his grandmother's hands had worn into the wood. The second compartment, the one that held the money and the list, remained sealed behind the fabric he had so carefully replaced. He could still feel its outline in his mind, the hidden thickness that no longer seemed like an accident of construction, but like a deliberate choice made decades ago. He laid the newspaper clippings across his small kitchen table, arranging them in chronological order with the patience of someone assembling a puzzle without a reference image. The earliest spoke of a fire that had consumed a row of houses on the outskirts of town, displacing families whose names he recognized now from the list. Later, articles hinted at a stalled investigation, a lack of evidence, a developer who had quietly withdrawn from the project only to reappear under a different corporate name. Between the lines of print, he could almost hear his grandmother's silence, the way she must have read these stories and decided that waiting for justice to arrive on its own was a luxury she could not afford. The photographs, when he studied them more closely, revealed patterns he had missed in the garage. The same faces appeared in different settings over the years, older, thinner, sometimes flanked by children who grew taller from one image to the next. These were not random snapshots. They were records of survival. On the back of one, he found a brief note that made no sense until he compared it to an article about a legal dispute over property boundaries. The handwriting matched. His grandmother had been tracking these people, documenting their lives as if she were their archivist, their witness. The land deed haunted him most. He traced the printed letters of her name again and again, trying to reconcile the authority of the document with the woman who had never once spoken of owning anything beyond the modest house where she had died. The property lay not far from the site of the fire described in the clippings, He drove there one afternoon and found an empty lot fenced off with sagging wire, weeds pushing through a cracked asphalt. A sign announced plans for future development, but there was no sign of work, only the silence of something that had been forgotten on purpose. That night, he dreamed of flames licking at the legs of the chair, consuming it until the hidden compartments burst open and spilled their contents into the air like a flock of birds. He woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth and the conviction that whatever had happened to his grandmother had not ended with her. It had simply waited for him to notice. He took the list from its hiding place again and spread it across his desk, marking the entries he had already confirmed. The names were not clustered in one neighborhood or one year. They spanned decades and districts, a quiet network of need and response that had operated beneath the surface of ordinary life. He could not yet articulate what it meant, only that it suggested a pattern of care that did not fit with any narrative he had ever been told about her. When he chose the next address to visit, he did so with intention. The name was crossed out in a bold stroke, as though the task associated with it had been completed to his grandmother's satisfaction. The building was a low structure near the river, its paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the breeze. He recognized the surname from one of the newspaper articles. The family, whose eviction had been mentioned in passing, dismissed as a footnote to a larger story about redevelopment. This time he knocked. A woman in her 50s answered, her expression wary until she saw the photograph he held out to her. He did not speak, could not find the words, but he did not need to. Recognition crossed her face, followed by something like relief. She stepped aside to let him in, and for a moment he stood in a narrow hallway that smelled of clean laundry and boiled coffee, surrounded by the quiet evidence of a life that had not fallen apart after all. He left less than an hour later, the details of the visit blurring together in his mind, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too heavy to carry all at once. He knew now that the list was not a record of debts owed to his grandmother. It was a ledger of lives she had intervened in, quietly, decisively, when the world had turned its back. The money in the chair was not a hoard but a tool, a resource she had built over time for a purpose no one else had been aware of. On the walk home, he felt as though the city had shifted slightly around him, its familiar streets threaded with invisible connections that only he could see. The addresses on the list were no longer abstract coordinates, but doors he could open, stories he could touch. The chair in his apartment was no longer a piece of inherited furniture, but the center of a map he had only just begun to read. That evening, he sat on the edge of his bed, the list in his lap, and allowed himself to imagine his grandmother's life as something other than the quiet routine he had always assumed. He saw her walking these same streets years before, envelope in her purse, eyes alert to needs others ignored. He saw her returning to the chair each night, lowering herself into its worn embrace, knowing that beneath the fabric lay not only money and paper, but the accumulated weight of choices that had shaped lives far beyond her own. By the time he rose to put the list away, the initial shock of discovery had hardened into resolve. He could not pretend that he had not found these things. He could not push the chair back into a corner and allow its secrets to fade into the background noise of his own survival. Whatever his grandmother had been doing, she had done it alone for too long. The first layer of her secret had been exposed, and it was already pulling him deeper into a story he was no longer content to observe from a distance. The chair no longer looked the same in the pale morning light. Its worn silhouette stood near the window like a patient witness, the sagging seat hiding not only fabric and foam, but the accumulated weight of his grandmother's secret life. He woke with the list still folded in his hand, having fallen asleep with it against his chest, and for a few seconds he did not remember where he was or why his fingers ached. Then the images of the previous day returned with painful clarity. The wary face of the woman by the river, the smell of boiled coffee, the knowledge that his grandmother had reached into places he had never even noticed. He moved carefully around the apartment, as though afraid a sudden gesture might disturb the fragile order he had only just begun to assemble in his mind. The list lay open on the table beside the land deed and the photographs. He had copied the entries into a notebook the night before, adding the dates he could infer from the clippings, marking the names he had confirmed with a small circle. There were far more unmarked names than those he had touched, and each one was an unanswered question pressing in on him. He returned the list to the cavity beneath the chair's seat, not because he feared losing it, but because he felt the need to maintain the ritual his grandmother had established. This was where the truth had lived, unseen, but not abandoned. When he sealed the fabric again, he left a small opening, enough to reach inside without dismantling the chair each time. It was a compromise between preservation and access, a physical reflection of the balance he was trying to strike in his own life. The money was harder to look at. He spread the bundles across his desk and counted them slowly, the way his grandmother must have done when she added to the cash. The total was not enough to buy back the land that had been taken from her, not enough to erase decades of neglect, but it was enough to make a difference in ways that were immediate and human. Enough to cover rent for a family in crisis, to pay for medication, to keep a child in school for another year. He felt a twist of guilt at the thought that this quiet power had been sitting in his grandmother's living room all those years, a few inches beneath the place where she rested every evening. The list became his map. He chose names at random at first, following addresses into parts of the city he had rarely visited, learning to read the subtle signals of neighborhoods that were always on the edge of being erased. In one building, he found a man whose eviction notice had been rescinded just in time years ago, though he had never known why. In another, he discovered a family who spoke of an anonymous benefactor who had paid for a child's surgery when the hospital refused to proceed without a guarantee. Each encounter filled in another piece of his grandmother's unseen network, a web of small interventions that had rippled outward in ways he was only beginning to grasp. With every confirmation, the list grew heavier in his hands. The crossed-out names no longer suggested tasks completed, but lives redirected, paths nudged away from disaster. He began to notice patterns in the notes beside certain entries. The word winter appeared next to addresses in the coldest districts, surgery next to families whose medical bills had once threatened to drown them. The simplicity of the annotations belied the complexity of the situations they represented. His grandmother had reduced crises to single words, not because she did not understand their gravity, but because she had learned to act without embellishment. One evening, he found himself standing in front of a building on the far side of town, the address circled in his notebook because of the faint pencil mark he had discovered next to it on the original list. The name belonged to a woman who had lost her husband in the same fire that appeared in the earliest clippings. The apartment door was opened by a teenager who looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He left that building hours later with a sense of having stepped into a story that was still unfolding, one that his grandmother had entered long before he had been old enough to notice the world's fractures. He did not hand out money blindly. He listened, observed, let the fragments of other people's lives settle around him before he acted. Sometimes the help was direct, a transfer that kept utilities from being shut off. Other times it was indirect, a connection made, a document copied, a problem reframed so that a solution could be found. In doing so, he felt himself becoming something he had never planned to be, an intermediary between a hidden past and an uncertain present. The chair watched over these transformations in silence. It stood where it always had, a piece of furniture that had outlived its purpose only to acquire a new one. He began to understand why his grandmother had chosen it as her repository. It was ordinary enough to escape notice, sturdy enough to endure, intimate enough to remain close to her body. The act of sitting on it each night had been both habit and vow, a way of keeping her commitments literally beneath her. The more he followed the list, the more he saw how his grandmother's own losses were woven into the fabric of her generosity. The land deed was no longer an isolated curiosity, but the missing link in a chain of events that had reshaped her life. The fire, the development project, the vanished records were not separate tragedies, but facets of the same wound. In helping others, she had been rehearsing for a justice she could not claim for herself, turning her personal defeat into a collective resistance. He found her handwriting everywhere, not just on the list and the photographs, but in the margins of his own memories. The way she had insisted on keeping old envelopes, the way she had folded papers into precise squares, the way she had always known when to arrive and when to leave. These habits, once invisible, now seemed like the scaffolding of a life built around quiet defiance. One night, exhausted from another day spent tracing addresses and absorbing stories that refused to stay contained, he sat down on the edge of the chair and let himself sink into its repaired seat for the first time. It creaked under his weight, the sound oddly comforting. He imagined his grandmother in the same posture, eyes closed, hands folded, the secrets of so many lives pressed against her from below. For a moment, the distance between them collapsed, and he felt as though he were not only inheriting her chair, but continuing a motion she had begun long before he knew to watch. The list was no longer just a relic. It was an instruction, a blueprint for a way of living that rejected spectacle in favor of persistence. As he returned it to its hiding place that night, he did so with care that bordered on reverence, aware that each name represented not a task to be checked off, but a story he was now responsible for carrying forward. The more addresses he visited, the more the city rearranged itself in his mind. Streets he had once passed without a second glance now carried echoes of voices he could not forget. Stairwells that smelled of damp concrete and cooking oil were no longer anonymous corridors, but gateways to stories that had almost been erased. His grandmother's list had begun as a series of names written in tidy lines, but it was becoming something else entirely, a living archive that refused to remain confined to paper. He learned to move quietly through these spaces, not as a savior and not as an intruder, but as a witness. People did not always want to talk. Some doors closed before he could explain why he was there, and he had to accept that his grandmother's presence had meant something different to each person she had helped. For some, she had been a brief miracle. For others, a source of embarrassment they preferred not to revisit. He respected those boundaries even when curiosity gnawed at him, because he sensed that her work had depended on this same restraint. Over time, patterns emerged that he could no longer ignore. The families she had supported were often connected by the same invisible threads that ran through the newspaper clippings. Many had lost their homes in fires, or through evictions that followed suspiciously similar legal procedures. Others had endured medical emergencies at moments when their insurance had lapsed or their employment had vanished. It was as if his grandmother had positioned herself at the intersections where the system failed most reliably, stepping in where bureaucracy stalled and compassion was absent. These revelations reframed his memories of her. He recalled the afternoons she returned late, the way she had sometimes sat in her chair with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, as though she were gathering strength from the quiet. He had once assumed she was simply tired. Now he wondered how many burdens she had been carrying in those moments. How many lives she had held in the balance while he complained about his own small disappointments. The chair itself became a kind of compass. Each time he uncovered another story, he returned to it, resting his hand on the worn backrest as if seeking permission to continue. The ritual grounded him, reminded him that he was not inventing this path but following one that had been laid out with care. In those moments, the apartment felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a continuation of a larger, unseen household that had always existed just beyond his awareness. One afternoon, he found himself in a hospital corridor, waiting for news about a woman whose name had been crossed out on the list with a heavy stroke. The atmosphere was thick with the low hum of machines and the soft shuffling of shoes, a place where hope and fear shared the same stale air. He remembered the note next to her name, the word surgery written in smaller script, and understood that his grandmother had been here too, decades earlier, navigating the same sterile hallways with an envelope hidden in her coat. The woman survived, and when he left the building he felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it was almost painful, not only for the life that had been spared but for the proof that his grandmother's interventions had not been in vain. His understanding of her past deepened with each encounter. He began to suspect that the loss of her own home had not been a single event, but the culmination of a series of injustices that had unfolded over years. The fire, reported in the newspapers, had not been an accident in the way the articles suggested. It was part of a pattern that pushed families out of valuable land under the cover of misfortune and legal ambiguity. She had been one of those families, her name quietly erased from the records, her claim dissolved into a maze of altered documents and missing signatures. This realization unsettled him more than any of the money or photographs. It meant that her generosity had not been born solely of kindness, but of defiance. She had chosen to fight a system that had wronged her by refusing to let it claim others in the same way. The list was not charity in the conventional sense. It was a countermeasure, a means of redistributing what had been taken under the guise of legality. He felt the weight of this legacy most acutely when he returned to the empty lot marked by the land deed. He stood there in the wind, the fence rattling behind him, and imagined the house that had once stood on this patch of neglected ground. He imagined his grandmother moving through its rooms, planning a life that had been interrupted by forces she could not control. The fact that she had never spoken of this loss now seemed less like modesty and more like a strategic silence. She had not wanted pity. She had wanted continuity. As the weeks passed, his own life began to shift in subtle ways. He stopped thinking of himself as someone who merely stumbled upon a secret. He became an active participant in a process that stretched back further than he could trace. He kept meticulous records, mirroring his grandmother's style, noting not just transactions but impressions, small details that might matter later. In doing so, he felt closer to her than he ever had when she was alive, connected not by blood alone, but by a shared purpose that transcended their individual circumstances. Yet with this closeness came a growing unease. The more he understood the scope of what she had been doing, the clearer it became that she had not been acting in a vacuum. The newspaper clippings hinted at powerful interests at individuals who had benefited from the displacement of families like his own. He had not yet encountered direct resistance, but he sensed it in the gaps between records, in the sudden silence that followed certain inquiries. It was as though the past were testing his resolve, gauging whether he would retreat at the first sign of discomfort. He did not retreat. Instead, he leaned further into the work, using the list not only as a guide to those in need, but as a key to unraveling the story of how his grandmother had been stripped of her rights. The faces in the photographs began to align with the names in the articles, forming a network of witnesses whose experiences overlapped in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The chair in his apartment now held more than money and memories. It held the possibility of restitution, however incomplete, for a history that had been deliberately obscured. At night, he would sit in the darkened room, the city's distant traffic murmuring through the window, and feel the tension between gratitude and anger pull at him from opposite sides. Gratitude for the woman who had shaped his life without his knowledge, and anger at the world that had forced her to do so in secrecy. The list in his lap was warm from the heat of his hands, a tangible reminder that the past was not finished with him yet. The anger that had been smoldering quietly beneath his gratitude finally found direction. Until now, following the list had felt like stepping into a current that carried him along without requiring decisions that reached too far beyond the present. But the land deed refused to stay buried in the cavity beneath the chair. Its official language, its faded stamps and signatures, kept calling him back to that fenced-off lot where weeds pushed through the cracked asphalt as if trying to reclaim what had been taken. He began to understand that helping the people his grandmother had supported was not enough. Her life had not only been shaped by generosity, but by dispossession, and if he wanted to honor the full weight of her story, he would have to confront the machinery that had erased her. His first visits to the municipal archive were almost farcical in their futility. He arrived with copies of the deed, the newspaper clippings, the photographs, expecting that someone, somewhere, would see the obvious discrepancy between what had been printed decades ago and what now existed in the digital records. Instead, he was met with polite confusion and procedural shrugs. Files were missing, boxes had been relocated, indexes had been reformatted so many times that the original references no longer aligned with anything tangible. Each visit ended with the same phrase delivered in slightly different tones that the information he sought could not be located. At first, he blamed inefficiency. He imagined dusty basements where clerks had misplaced folders, forgotten to label shelves, failed to migrate data from paper to screen. But the pattern was too consistent. The land parcel number led nowhere. The development project named in the clippings had vanished from the city's official history, replaced by a neutral entry that mentioned only a zoning revision and an eventual abandonment of the site. The fire that had displaced so many families was recorded, but the names attached to the addresses were not the ones he recognized from his grandmother's list. It was as though someone had reached back in time and carefully blurred the faces out of the record. He began to reconstruct the timeline himself, pinning photocopies to the corkboard above his desk in the same way others mapped out fictional crimes. A fire in 1 year, a sudden change in property ownership the next, a company dissolving and reappearing under a new name a few months later. A cluster of evictions following an obscure court ruling that no one seemed able to explain. The fragments refused to assemble into a single clear picture, but they suggested a process that was deliberate, patient, and devastatingly effective. The photographs from the chair became his most valuable tools. He scanned them at high resolution and enlarged the background details, street signs, storefronts, bits of graffiti that could be traced to specific neighborhoods. He spent evenings comparing these images to archived maps and satellite photographs, searching for landmarks that had survived the city's relentless revisions. Slowly, with the persistence his grandmother must have cultivated in silence, he began to place the people in those photographs within a geography that had been rewritten but not entirely erased. It was during one of these late nights that he noticed the first sign that he was not as invisible as he had thought. An envelope appeared in his mailbox without a return address. Inside was nothing but a single sheet of paper bearing a photocopy of the land deed he had been using, except that several of the names were circled in red. He recognized them immediately. They belonged to individuals who appeared repeatedly in the newspaper clippings, men who had signed off on zoning changes, approved development permits, dismissed appeals. The message was not explicit, but its implication was unmistakable. Someone was paying attention. He told himself it was coincidence, a prank, a product of his own rising paranoia. Yet, the following week, when he attempted to access a batch of files that had previously been listed as available, he was informed that they were now restricted due to privacy concerns. The clerk's tone was apologetic, but her eyes slid away from his as she spoke. The barrier had shifted from inconvenience to obstruction. Despite this, he did not stop. If anything, the pressure sharpened his focus. He reached out to a local journalist whose work on municipal corruption had earned both awards and enemies. He did not reveal the full scope of what he had found, only enough to spark interest. The journalist listened, skeptical but attentive, and agreed to look into the matter. It was the first time he had allowed someone outside his grandmother's invisible circle to glimpse the outline of her story, and the decision filled him with a nervous energy he had not felt since the day he first opened the chair. At the same time, he continued to follow the list, not neglecting the people who had become part of his daily reality. The juxtaposition was disorienting. In the morning, he might sit with the family trying to navigate a maze of social services. In the afternoon, he would pore over documents that hinted at systemic theft on a scale too large to measure. The contrast made it impossible to separate the abstract injustice of lost land from the concrete consequences that played out in kitchens and hospital rooms across the city. The deeper he went, the more he understood why his grandmother had chosen secrecy. The forces that had stripped her of her home were not faceless. They were represented by signatures, by official seals, by men whose careers had flourished on the quiet disappearance of others. She had not been silent because she lacked the truth. She had been silent because she had recognized the futility of confronting power head-on without allies or leverage. Instead, she had built something else, a parallel system of support that operated beneath notice, sustained by the same patience that had kept the chair intact through years of neglect. The threat became more tangible one evening when he returned to his apartment to find the door to the garage ajar. The chair stood where he had left it, untouched, but the sense of intrusion was unmistakable. He could not prove that anyone had been there, yet the air felt altered, as though the space itself had been disturbed. He checked the cavity beneath the seat, his hands shaking despite himself. Everything was still in place: the documents, the money, the list. But the incident left him with the cold realization that the very object that had anchored his grandmother's life might now draw unwanted attention to his own. He considered, for the first time, the possibility of stopping. The idea was seductive in its simplicity. He could return the chair to its place by the window, seal the compartments for good, and focus on the small, manageable acts of kindness that required no confrontation with institutions that had already proven their ability to erase inconvenient truths. But when he imagined doing so, he felt a hollowness that frightened him more than any anonymous envelope or ajar door. To stop now would be to accept the narrative that had been imposed on his grandmother, to allow her loss to remain a footnote to someone else's success. So he continued, with greater care and a growing awareness of risk. He digitized everything, storing copies in places no single disruption could reach. He learned to vary his routines, to blend into the background the way his grandmother must have done when she carried envelopes through these same streets. And, in moments of doubt, he returned to the chair, resting his hand on its backrest and feeling the faint vibration of the city through the window, a reminder that the past he was chasing was not dead, but waiting to be acknowledged. By the end of the month, he had assembled enough fragments to glimpse the outline of a scheme that spanned decades. It was not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense, but a convergence of incentives that rewarded those who could navigate the gray areas of law and punish those who could not. His grandmother had been caught in that convergence, her name quietly deleted from the ledger of legitimate ownership. The list beneath the chair was her answer to that deletion, a way of writing herself back into a story that others had tried to end. The chair no longer felt like a relic from another life. It had become a working instrument, a silent center of a system that now extended far beyond the walls of his apartment. After the incident in the garage, after the realization that his grandmother's past was no longer safely confined to yellowed clippings and hidden compartments, he began to operate with the same deliberate caution he imagined had guided her. He changed the way he moved through the city, varying his routes, timing his visits so that patterns would be harder to trace, keeping his notes in coded shorthand that would mean nothing to anyone who did not already know the story. The list was no longer a mystery, but a mandate. He selected names with intention now, focusing first on those whose notes suggested immediate danger. A winter entry led him to a basement apartment where a mother and her 2 children had been living without heat for weeks, the pipes long since frozen and split. The money from the chair paid for repairs, but it was the follow-up, the return visits and the coordination with a local charity that transformed the crisis into a turning point rather than a brief reprieve. In doing so, he began to understand the depth of his grandmother's commitment. She had not simply dropped envelopes and disappeared. She had built scaffolding where others saw only wreckage. At the same time, he pursued the truth about the land with a quiet persistence that surprised even him. The journalist he had contacted called one evening with a voice that was equal parts excitement and caution. There were connections, she said, between the development company named in the clippings and a series of shell corporations that had acquired property in distressed neighborhoods over the years. The trail was cold, but not dead. It was the first confirmation from outside his own research that he was not chasing ghosts. These parallel efforts created a rhythm in his days that left little room for the aimlessness that had once defined him. Mornings were spent poring over records, afternoons visiting addresses, evenings entering data into the same kind of ledger his grandmother had kept in her head for so long. He began to see his work not as a burden, but as an inheritance in the truest sense, something that carried both privilege and obligation. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed too heavily on his chest. He would sit in the chair and let his thoughts wander back to the person he had been before this began, a man drifting from one temporary job to another, measuring his life in paychecks that never quite stretched far enough. Now he was responsible for a network of fragile hopes, for secrets that could upend careers, for a legacy that demanded more than passive admiration. In those moments, he wished, fleetingly, that he had chosen something easier to inherit. But ease had never been part of his grandmother's vocabulary, and the chair beneath him seemed to absorb his doubts, returning only the steady reassurance of its presence. He imagined her sitting here decades earlier, balancing the same conflicting impulses, choosing again and again to act despite the risks. The realization gave him strength. He was not inventing a new path. He was extending one that had been carefully carved by someone who had refused to disappear quietly. The resistance he encountered grew more subtle. Files that had once been accessible were now missing entire sections. Requests for information were met with delays that stretched into months. Once, he noticed a car idling across the street from a building he was about to enter, its windows too dark to reveal anything inside. It drove away when he approached, leaving behind nothing he could point to as evidence, only the tightening of his senses that told him he was no longer operating in obscurity. Rather than retreat, he adapted. He learned to use intermediaries to share pieces of information with people who could pursue them from different angles. The journalist was one such ally. A community legal clinic became another, its overworked attorneys grateful for any lead that might help them challenge the machinery of eviction and foreclosure. Through these connections, he began to see how his grandmother's isolated efforts could evolve into something more resilient, a network that did not depend on the secrecy of a single chair. Yet he never relinquished the core ritual. Each night he returned the list and the money to their place beneath the seat, sealing the cavity with the same care she had shown. The chair was no longer merely a hiding place. It was a symbol, a reminder that even the most ordinary objects could harbor revolutions if someone was willing to look closely enough. Small victories sustained him. A family removed from the brink of homelessness. A legal appeal granted an unexpected hearing. A former neighbor of his grandmother willing, after years of silence, to share what she remembered about the day the fire tore through their street. These moments did not erase the enormity of what had been taken, but they affirmed the possibility of restoration, however incomplete it might be. One evening, as he updated his records, he realized that he had begun to add his own notes beside his grandmother's. Where she had written winter or surgery, he now wrote relocation or injunction. The list was evolving, becoming a palimpsest of two lives intertwined across time. The act filled him with a mix of pride and melancholy, pride at the continuity he was creating, melancholy at the cost that continuity had exacted from her. He no longer felt like the object of his family's laughter, the man who had inherited nothing but a broken chair. That version of himself seemed distant, almost unrecognizable. The chair in the corner was still worn and imperfect, but it had become the axis around which his life turned, the physical manifestation of a promise he had never made aloud, but felt bound to keep. His grandmother had transformed her loss into a quiet mission that spanned decades. Now it was his turn to carry that mission forward, to ensure that the story hidden beneath the fabric of an old chair would not end with him. By the time winter began to press its dull thumb against the city, he understood that the chair could not remain in its half-repaired state. It had carried his grandmother's weight for decades, had carried his in the months since her death, and it had carried the deeper burden of everything she had hidden and everything he had added. The wobble in its frame was no longer merely a practical problem. It felt like an unfinished sentence, a gap between what had been endured and what now needed to be preserved. He had delayed the restoration because he feared what the act might imply. To repair the chair fully meant accepting that his grandmother was truly gone, that the evenings she had spent in that corner would never return. In its current condition, the chair still belonged to the past, its frayed upholstery and peeling finish acting as proof that time had not yet been smoothed over. But he had also come to realize that preservation did not mean freezing something in decay. It meant giving it a future. He began by studying the chair as if it were a living thing. He photographed every angle, measured the joints, traced the carved patterns in the wood with his fingertips. In the nicks and scratches, he saw a map of ordinary life. The mark where a child's toy had struck the leg, the shallow dent where a heavy pot must have been rested against it in a moment of distraction, the worn curve on the backrest where his grandmother's palm had returned night after night. He wanted to keep those marks. They were not flaws. They were evidence. He considered taking the chair to a professional restorer, but the thought of someone else opening the compartments made his stomach tighten. The chair's secrets had already drawn attention. He could not risk handing it over to anyone who might be careless or curious or simply unaware of what it represented. So he decided to do the work himself, even if it took longer and demanded skills he did not yet possess. He gathered tools slowly, buying them one at a time as he could afford them, borrowing what he could from neighbors, reading guides late into the night. The process felt strangely similar to his work with the list. Both required patience. Both demanded that he look beyond surfaces and understand structure. He learned how to loosen old joints without splitting the wood, how to remove upholstery without tearing the fragile layers beneath, how to treat the frame so it would not warp in the dry heat of his apartment. Before he dismantled anything, he removed the documents and money from the chair and placed them in protective sleeves and sealed boxes. It felt like removing a heart before surgery, an act both intimate and frightening. He sat at his table with the land deed spread in front of him, the photographs stacked neatly, the list folded carefully, and realized that this pile of paper contained more than evidence and accounts. It contained the essence of his grandmother's hidden life and the beginnings of his own transformation. He repaired the frame first. The chair's bones were sound but weakened by years of strain. He tightened screws that had worked themselves loose, replaced worn dowels, reinforced joints with careful additions that would not alter the chair's original shape. Each adjustment felt like an echo of what he had been doing in the world outside his apartment, strengthening fragile structures so they could bear weight again. The parallel was impossible to ignore. When he sanded away splinters and smoothed the edges, he thought of the jagged bureaucratic obstacles he had encountered in the archives, of the way power left sharp corners in the lives of ordinary people. When he applied glue and clamped the wood until it held, he thought of the connections he had been forming, the allies he had found, the small acts of cohesion that could prevent collapse. The upholstery was the hardest part. Beneath the faded fabric lay layers of history, each stitched and restitched in different years, some by machine, some by hand. He discovered patches where his grandmother had reinforced the seat with extra cloth, creating the compartments that had sheltered her secrets. He moved slowly, refusing to destroy anything that might still matter. He cleaned what could be cleaned, saved what could be saved, and replaced only what had become too fragile to endure. He chose a new fabric that matched the chair's original tone, not to make it look new, but to make it whole. As he worked, the chair's presence changed. It began to feel less like a relic from his grandmother's home and more like an object that belonged to both of them. In its restored form, it would not erase her. It would carry her forward. The thought steadied him in moments when his hands shook from fatigue or frustration. When the chair was finally ready to be reassembled, He opened the cavity beneath the seat one last time to make sure it could still serve its purpose. He lined it with a protective layer to guard against moisture and insects, a practical measure that felt like an act of reverence. Then he returned the documents, not loose as they had been, but organized, sealed, preserved. He included not only the original clippings and photographs, but copies of the new materials he had gathered, scanned records, notes from witnesses, contact information for the journalist and the legal clinic, and a continuation of the ledger where he had begun to record his own interventions. The list was no longer only his grandmother's. It was the living record of a mission that had outgrown its origin. When he lowered the new upholstery into place and secured it, he did so with a strange sense of finality. The chair was closed again, its heart hidden, but now it was hidden with intention rather than desperation. The secrets beneath the seat were no longer merely protected from discovery. They were protected for the sake of endurance, so that the story could survive long enough to reach whatever conclusion it demanded. He placed the restored chair back by the window, in the same position it had occupied in his grandmother's house. The winter light that filtered through the glass was thin and gray, but it fell across the chair in a way that made the carved wood glow softly. He stood back and looked at it for a long time, seeing not just an object but a timeline made tangible. In its structure, he saw his grandmother's evenings, the quiet resilience she had worn like a coat. In its hidden compartments, he saw the people she had helped and the people he had begun to help. In its renewed fabric, he saw the possibility that something damaged could be repaired without losing its identity. That night, he sat in the chair fully for the first time, not perching on the edge as he had before, but settling into it as if it were his rightful place. The frame held steady. The seat supported him without creaking. The sensation was unfamiliar and yet deeply right, as though the chair had been waiting for this exact moment. He imagined his grandmother's hands on the armrest, the warmth of her presence lingering in the grain of the wood. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. The chair itself was the conversation, a language of persistence and memory that required no words. Outside, the city continued its restless motion. Somewhere, files were still being hidden, signatures still being used to reshape neighborhoods, power still behaving as if it could erase whatever it wanted. Somewhere, families still hovered on the edge of eviction, still waited in hospital corridors, still feared the cold. But inside his small apartment, beside the window, a restored chair stood like a quiet refusal. It held within it proof that erasure was not complete as long as someone remembered, as long as someone recorded, as long as someone acted. The laughter of his relatives felt distant now, almost irrelevant, like the echo of a bad joke told in another lifetime. They had seen only decay and uselessness in an old chair. They had not understood that some things gained their value precisely because they were overlooked. He had inherited more than wood and fabric. He had inherited a way of living that turned loss into purpose, silence into strategy, memory into action. In the months that followed, he continued his work, visiting addresses, updating the ledger, meeting with the journalist and the legal clinic, adding small victories to the growing archive beneath the chair's seat. The land case moved slowly, caught in the gears of bureaucracy, but it moved. Witnesses came forward. Documents surfaced in unexpected places. Public questions were asked. The story that had once been confined to the cavity beneath a worn seat began to seep into the wider world, no longer easily contained. Yet the chair remained his anchor. Each time he doubted himself, each time fear rose in his throat, he returned to it and sat, feeling the steady support beneath him. He understood then that the chair's true power was not in what it hid, but in what it represented. It was proof that a life lived quietly could still shape other lives profoundly. It was proof that memory could be a form of resistance, and it was proof that his grandmother, though gone, had not been erased. She had written herself into him, into the ledger, into the restored frame by the window, in a way that no corrupted archive could ever fully undo. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss what comes next. Watch our other videos to uncover more stories that change lives, and share this video with someone who needs to see it today.